Welcome to Democracy Differently, the podcast about why democracy isn't working and how to fix it. I'm your host for today, Jess, and I'm joined with Danny Shaw. So Danny Shaw is a commentator on policing and criminal justice and has spent over 30 years at the BBC News. He was also previously a visiting journalism lecturer at City St George's University and now provides media training and communications advice, regularly chairs and speaks at conferences and commentates and writes for various news outlets. Danny was also a former advisor to Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper. So thank you so much, Danny, for coming on today.
Good to be here, Jess. Hi.
Great. So let's get stuck in then. We always ask everyone the same first question. So in a sentence, what do you see as the single biggest problem with democracy?
I think the single biggest problem with democracy is people taking it for granted.
Lovely, short and sweet. I like that. We often see kind of disputes between politicians and the judiciary in the news. But what is the relationship between politics or democracy and the justice system?
Well, in England and Wales, and that's the area that I focus on, is the area that I've reported on and know most about. But it's similar to other common law jurisdictions. There is a clear dividing line between the judiciary, between the law, and between the executive and legislative functions. And the courts, judges are there to apply the law and interpret the law when there are legal disputes. They're not there to interfere in policy making, but of course, that there's a sort of grey area because often they have to adjudicate on contentious areas of policy, and they have to sometimes say whether the government has acted lawfully or not. And sometimes that can mean that a policy is ditched as a result of their rulings. And I don't think you can completely take politics out of lawmaking. I think judges are generally sort of aware of the political climate when they make decisions on very topical or key issues. They're not immune to that public opinion. I don't think they would ever say it, but I think they can sometimes see the way the wind is blowing on some issues. But that's not to say that they don't apply the law as it should be applied. And sometimes they make decisions that can go against public opinion or popular opinion. But I do think there is awareness in the judiciary, in the courts, about where politics is at.
Great, thanks. And maybe going a little bit more meta, I guess, about your role as a journalist. How important do you think transparency and journalism is around policing and the justice system for healthy democracies?
Hugely important. I'm a massive believer in transparency and openness in policing and the justice system. And you have to keep fighting for it all the time. We have a system in this country where if someone is charged with an offence, we're entitled to know who that individual is, as long as they're not a child, as long as they're 18 or over. There was a recent case involving an alleged war crime in which the person accused was not named by the police or the Crown Prosecution Service until the case came before magistrates, and the media had to oppose reporting restrictions, and the magistrate agreed and said, reiterated the importance of free and fair reporting and open justice in that particular case. And I think that's just one example that the media has to be constantly fighting against reporting restrictions in trials, There are all sorts of rules about what we can and can't report when matters come to court. And, when a case is under investigation or police are conducting investigation, they don't go around telling us all about their investigation and what they're doing. That's quite right. But, and I understand why that's the case, but that's also why it's so important for journalists to have the freedom to be able to push those boundaries and keep pushing them in legitimate ways. I don't mean via unethical or illegal ways, but in asking questions, in probing, in submitting freedom of information requests, in arguing the case in courts if reporting restrictions are up for grabs and so on. Absolutely vital for accountability, for people to be able to see justice being done, to be able to hold the police to account.
If journalism and news media have an important role to play in how we discuss things around judiciaries and policing, we often see that as the role that the government plays, right? They're there to set the policy agenda for us. But do you think journalism also has a role there?
Yeah, journalism has a vital role in campaigning. There are some campaigns that have been launched by the news media, newspapers in particular, that have led to policy changes because, editors or particular reporters feel strongly about it. Investigative journalism has a massive role to play. If we think about the grooming scandal, the paper that first uncovered that was the Times. And it's late reporter Andrew Norfolk who did amazing work on that. That wouldn't have come to light if it hadn't been for journalism. We think about the MP's expenses scandal going back a few years. Again, the Telegraph was the paper that did all the digging on that. And we've got, the Epstein files. Newspapers have done digging around that and exposed that. Prince, the former Prince Andrew, think about the interview he did with Emily Maitlis on Newsnight. I mean, there's so many examples of newspapers through campaigns, through really robust investigative journalism that has led to policy changes and major events happening that wouldn't have happened otherwise. And of course, just in the run-of-the-mill sort of debates around policy, newspapers, the media in general, has a vital role to play in airing those debates, in giving a voice to people who perhaps otherwise, wouldn't have a voice. I mean, you think of victims of sexual assault and rape, in numerous cases of high-profile cases in America and here. It's the media that have amplified some of those concerns and led to changes in policy.
Yeah, great. And if we can discuss maybe a little bit more about your specific area of journalism in kind of policing and the judiciary, do you think there are any areas there that receive insufficient democratic scrutiny?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think that it used to be the case that the courts, the criminal courts, civil courts, tribunals were better covered than they are now. But we don't have as many specialist journalists and reporters who are dedicated to covering the courts, so they don't get as much coverage. Of course, the big cases still do. The cases at the Old Bailey in London will still be covered. And the large urban centres with big criminal courts, the High Court in London, there'll still be coverage of cases, but there are so many cases across the country all the time that are not getting the attention, that perhaps hidden away. Immigration courts, I'm thinking of, and then you think of decisions being made by local councils that don't get the scrutiny because we don't have dedicated reporters at a local level. So those are the areas that I think we need to shine more of a light on.
Yeah, great. I think definitely the local area stuff is something that I personally would have never thought about, right? But it's definitely kind of happens behind closed doors, I guess, because we don't have journalism reporting on those areas. Maybe let's talk a little bit then about some of your work with Yvette Cooper. So you worked within her team for in 2023 and helped to shape some of the Labour policies around policing and prisons and there. So what strikes you as the areas that are most in need of reform or improvement in those areas?
I think the areas in criminal justice and policing that are most in need of reform are probably the areas where the government is attempting to make some changes. The most glaring examples are prisons, where the government inherited a terrible mess from the previous administration, where there just simply weren't enough places to send people. Now, we can all have a view about imprisonment, whether it's effective or not, whether we send too many people to prison or whether we send the wrong sort of people to prison. But the fact is, if you inherit a situation where simply prisons are going to run out of places within a few months, that is a terrible place to be, an absolutely shocking place to be when you actually work through what would happen in those circumstances, when the law can't be upheld, when people are convicted and are given a prison sentence and may not be able to go to prison as a result of that, maybe actually have to wait until there's a room in a prison. Just think about the dysfunction of a system, and we came very close to that. So I think the government inherited a terrible problem there, and it's attempted to deal with that, not just by investing in new prison places, but also having to introduce schemes to release prisoners early, to switch offenders to community sentences rather than short spells imprisonment, and various other changes. The other area is the court backlog, 80,000 cases in the Crown Courts. What that means is victims, witnesses and defendants waiting months, in some cases years, in some cases up to 4 years for their trial. You think about that, just imagine if you're the victim in a case or you're the accused and you are told this week your case is not going to be listed until 2030. There are a number of cases that are not listed till 2030. In fact, I had the figure to hand a moment ago. It's 29 trials are listed to 2030, 4 years from now. And I think there are 2,600 that have got a 2-year wait, including 200 rape trials. So that is the area where there is an urgent need for reform. The government's come up with some proposals which I broadly support, in fact, controversial though they are, to try and get the backlog down. And I think the third area where there's a real need for reform is policing. Policing is operating in a system which is incoherent, inefficient and ineffective. Police officers do a really difficult job, and by and large, I've got greatest admiration for them for what they do in situations which you and I would probably not even countenance or think about how dangerous they are. And yet they're not really served by the structures of policing, and the government's attempting to change that through a very ambitious police reform programme. I don't know if they'll get all of it onto the statute book, but I think their recent white paper is certainly worth looking at.
Great, thanks. And on the kind of politics side of all of this then, I think it's probably true to say that politicians often want to appear tough on crime in order to kind of maintain popularity, right, with the public. To what extent do you see this as either good or bad for both politics and the justice system?
Well, I think you have to be tough on crime, right? Look, crime is a really bad thing, and it has a debilitating effect not only on the individuals who are victims, but also on communities. And we cannot have a situation where crime is condoned or we go soft on it. I'm not a believer in that. And I think it's quite right for politicians to emphasize that. But what does that mean in practice? Being tough doesn't necessarily mean locking someone up for 5 years. It might mean imprisoning them for a certain length of time, and while they're in prison, ensuring that they come out in a better place with an understanding of the impact of their crime and with the tools to make a decent life for themselves on the outside. So there has to be, for me, there has to be a mix of punishment, and for people to see that someone's being punished for their crimes, and for the victims to feel that that person has got their just sort of deserts, as it were. Um, but also, that whole point of it, or one of the key points of it, is that actually there are fewer victims in future, and that the burglar or the robber who's sent to prison just doesn't come out and do the same thing over and over again. That's where we're really failing.
Maybe I think it's kind of been seen as a bit contrary to the tough on crime position, but the recent Sentencing Act of 2026, which is set to come into effect during March, is when we're recording this episode. It's received quite a lot of criticism in the media, I think, particularly because suspended sentences for minor crimes might come into force. So is this an example of good policy being bad politics, do you think, or is it something else entirely?
Look, I think the Sentencing Act was necessary because of the prison crisis that I described earlier. If the government had inherited a position where there are sufficient prison places at that time and also going forward, they wouldn't have put the Sentencing Act into effect. But they've had to do it. They didn't really have an alternative. Now, out of that crisis, some people think you might get some good things coming in, which is fewer short prison sentences and more community sentences. My own view is that short prison sentences can work in some cases and are necessary in some cases for offenders for whom they just repeatedly committing crimes. There are some people who actually will get a shock from a short prison sentence, and it may shock them into not carrying out crimes again. But I accept that there are a lot of people for whom it's incredibly disruptive and it doesn't really do any good. But the main issue is that we don't do enough work with people when they're in prison, and we don't do good enough work with people when they're in the community to ensure that they don't reoffend, to tackle the underlying behaviour. I believe in very tough sentences for sex offenders and violent offenders. I believe in long prison sentences to protect the public, because that's the important thing. But while they're in prison, they should be doing something constructive. And there needs to be work to try and do that. And I also think there needs to be an acceptance, very sadly, that there are some people who are so damaged or so unstable or so just intrinsically violent for whatever reasons that they're not safe to release them, or they can only be released with the most stringent conditions. We also have to accept that not everyone can be rehabilitated.
Do you think enforcing the law has become more politicised than in recent years? And is this a good thing or a bad thing for democracy in general?
Look, I think crime and policing have always been, for as long as I've been covering this area, have always been highly political and emotive areas, going back to the sort of the 1990s and the moral panic over the murder of James Bulger on Merseyside, through to the Stephen Lawrence case, in that decade. Dunblane shootings, and concerns about gun laws and so on, and we can go right through, and there's a whole history of cases which have exposed our fears about crime and worries about offenders and the lack of protection for the public, that have led to new laws and new measures being introduced, and it's become very political. And it is, and I don't think you can separate, politics from policing or crime. And I don't think it's got better or worse. I mean, I think there are some areas that have become less politically contentious. The area, I would say, of drugs policy. There was a big debate at the end of the 1990s and into the 2000s about, for example, cannabis and whether it should be decriminalized, whether it should be upgraded as a drug, and various other drugs came on the scene, and there was real live debates around that, around classification of drugs. That has become less of an issue over the past 15 or so years, and the consensus between the two main political parties, Labour and Conservatives, was that a strategy of law enforcement, of education and treatment was really the right approach, and a lot of investment actually went into treatment. Labour and the Conservatives invested quite heavily in those services, and that hasn't really been challenged until now. We see the emergence of the Green Party with an agenda, I think, to decriminalise all drugs. Now, if the Greens carry on with their trajectory of popular support, then I think drugs will suddenly become a big political issue again. But for the past 15 years, it just hasn't been on the agenda. Think about the general election. Did it ever come up as an issue? Never, despite the fact that drugs lie behind, I don't know, probably the majority of offending that takes place. I would say probably the majority of criminals in prison are there, either because they have an addiction to drugs, or they have been dealing drugs, or they've been in a gang that's involved in drug supply in some way. So extraordinary as it is, but that's probably the one area that isn't highly politicized at the moment.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a really interesting point, actually. Like you say, I haven't seen a lot of political kind of talk around drugs. Let's move on to the quickfire questions then that we like to ask people. So, how much does UK democracy owe to its legal system, do you think?
A huge amount. We have a really valued legal system that's admired, I think, the world over. And personally, as someone that's covered policing and criminal justice in the courts, I have to say, when I go to courts and I see judges delivering judgments off the top of their head on complex legal matters, I'm just in awe of what they do and how they do it. And the fact that they make decisions on really delicate issues and can remain sort of above the fray. So hugely important to democracy. Yeah.
Thanks. And do you think modern journalism does more good or harm to democracy?
Modern journalism is a force for good. There are elements of it that are really unhealthy and unsavory, but overall, it makes a massive difference to transparency, to uncovering wrongdoing and corruption, and generally, I think it's a vital part of democracy.
Great. And looking towards the future, then, are you optimistic about the future of journalism?
I'm optimistic about the ability of journalists to do reporting and uncover bad behaviour. And I think there's some fantastic investigative journalists around. It's changed. They're not just belong to the traditional media, but they may work for smaller outlets or do stuff by themselves. So we have a multiplicity of outlets. It's a very different landscape. I'm optimistic about that. I do worry about misinformation and disinformation, and how that is eroding trust in journalism. No one can really believe what's being said anymore, and that really concerns me.
Thanks. And I have one final question for you then. So if you had to pick one thing for democracy to do differently, what would it be?
That's really difficult. Because what I'd like to do is pick one thing that make people understand that this isn't something to be taken for granted, that they need to participate in. They need to take an active part in democracy, because when you live in a country that doesn't have democracy, you would give your right arm to be able to vote, be able to take part in a genuine election, to be able to belong to a political party, to make your debate, to go out on the street and make your point without being arrested or locked up or whatever. How we can get to that point, I don't know, but I think we certainly should consider whether voting becomes compulsory, as it is, I think, in Australia. I haven't looked into it in depth, But I think certainly there's a case for looking at that, because there needs to be something where from an early age people understand just how important it is to participate. And perhaps that's more education, from primary school onwards. People really understand that this is such an important, precious thing that we have, and they need to take a more active role in it. And, you stop criticizing politicians and stop condemning them and stop moaning about them. You have the opportunity to get up and be one yourself, if you don't like it.
Great, thanks. I think that's a really lovely note to end on, actually. So thanks again for joining me today, Danny.
You're very welcome, Jess. Thanks a lot.
And I've been your host today. So if you've enjoyed the episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe. And I hope that you join us for the next episode as well. Thanks.